Hello and welcome to the Introduction to Criminalisation and Family Violence. I would like to begin by acknowledging that we're on stolen land, the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and that sovereignty was never ceded. My name is Nina.
And I'm Ray. We work at Flat Out in the Family Violence Justice Project together. Flat Out is a statewide support and advocacy service for criminalised women, trans and gender diverse people and their kids. I just wanted to note that this training is an introduction. It's short. We kept it punchy. We just wanted to seed some ideas and encourage you to begin to deepen your practice and your understanding around the intersection of criminalisation and family violence. We're going to include some resources from the project with this when we put it online. So we really encourage you to use those as a springboard to start to do your own exploration expansion. So yeah, we're going to begin with a quote from one of the expert advisors that we consulted over the course of the project.
And these expert advisors the quotes are taken from one of the resources, and they have lived experience of criminalisation and are survivors of violence. And that I just want to note too that criminalised women have an impeccable ability of agency and self-determination, and have doing and been building creative safety plans outside of systems for a really, really long period of time. And this skill often isn't recognised, and this quote pertains to that. So when you're criminalised, you have to do everything for yourself and each other. We have the highest rates of domestic violence, trauma, and mental health because the system doesn't help. So we do it ourselves, the best way we can anyway. No one knows how smart and resilient we actually are.
Yeah, so really centre that agency as we dive into the content. We're about to look at some statistics to give you a bit of background context, but we just wanted to invite you to look at these through the lens of this idea of justice. You know, as we're looking at this information, think about what it says about who we're keeping safe and why and what from and how. This is a graph depicting the numbers of women discharged from Victorian prisons each month between 1998 and 2022. And we chose it because it really neatly depicts the overall increase in the number of women who are incarcerated. And that's due to a lot of reasons, tough on crime stances, bail law reforms, the increased cost of living, bottlenecks and backlogs in the criminal legal system. All of these things and more impact on the numbers of women who are inside. But also this graph shows clearly the significant increase in the number of women who are inside on remand, unsentenced, because they couldn't meet their bail conditions.
Yeah, and I mean, like, who is on remand and what sort of charges are they facing? They're definitely not violent offences. A lot of the offences are for minor drug-related charges or crimes of survival or poverty or homelessness. And these women can be sitting on remand for a long period of time, weeks, months, sometimes even years. And during that period of time when they're on remand, they don't have access to support services in community, and also don't have access to any of the programs that are run within the prison, which actually puts them at higher risk. And you can imagine if they're not getting supported, what that does to a human being. And also, once they have been released back into community, they also carry the digital footprint and the evidence that supports that they are a danger to community and that they've been sentenced and spent a time of imprisonment and experience all sorts of discriminatory action around the digital footprint that they carry around with them, especially when it comes to housing and employment.
Absolutely. And I mean, we don't believe that anybody should be locked up for any reason, but I think the issue of remand, particularly because it is so significantly increasing and is one of the reasons for the prison expansion that's currently happening in Victoria, is that it really highlights that absurdity of this idea of justice when you've got people who, simply don't have the resources and means to access their freedom, are inside for weeks and months, having their lives torn apart, kids taken away, losing housing, losing jobs, being branded as criminals for minor offences, for something that they would likely never be given a custodial sentence for anyway. It boggles the mind. And at the end of the day, freedom shouldn't be a commodity. It shouldn't be the case that someone who has the means should be able to go home and another person in the same, with the same charges should be locked up.
Exactly.
Yeah. So these are some general statistics around women who are leaving prison. Just wanted to note that these are all likely underrepresented because there's lots of reasons why people wouldn't disclose, and also lots of reasons why data systems don't capture the nuance and complexities of people's experiences. And we just wanted to also flag right away that these are not intended to somehow imply that criminalised women and trans and gender diverse people are somehow more vulnerable. They're not more vulnerable. In fact, as the quote at the start highlights, they're incredibly resilient and resourceful. These are meant to illustrate the impacts of these overlapping, intense layers of systemic harm and discrimination.
Systemic values.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Aboriginal women entering prison increased from 13% to 17% of all receptions from 2012 to 2017.
And over 50% of women will be homeless on release, compared with 0.4% of homelessness in the general population.
And 65% were diagnosed with a mental illness before entering prison.
And as we said before, the most common offences are property offences, crimes of poverty, shoplifting, handling stolen goods, and then very relevant for us, breaches of orders, including family violence intervention orders. Up to 90% of women in prison report a history of violence or abuse.
And women released from prison are 16 times more likely to die from violence than women in the Australian population of the same age.
Yeah. They're also 9 times more likely to be a victim of non-fatal violence.
And 69% are mothers. And I think that that's really important that that's been put in there because of the intergenerational trauma that people experience when they're separated from their primary caregivers.
Yeah. And 30% have a suspected ABI, and 30% a disability that impacts their everyday activities. I think this really shows, the rates of violence, the rates of family violence, the numbers of women inside who are caregivers. And it shows that, criminalised women are not a fringe issue. This is a central feminist issue and a central family violence issue. These are people who are most in need of our services and supports and the least likely to access them because they experience them as hostile or harmful, as we're going to unpack.
So this quote reads, "The system is the even bigger perpetrator behind the perpetrator. It just puts you through an even worse power and control nightmare."
Yeah. And I think, this really speaks to the system acting as a kind of hammer, and not only the hammer that can do harm of its own volition, take your kids away, lock you up, take your resources, control your actions and your movements, but also something that can be wielded by someone who wants to cause you harm. Think about the power and control impacts of somebody threatening to call the police on you, report you to child protection, and so on and so on. So, what does this mean really in terms of core risks and harms for criminalised women who are experiencing family violence? These are from the research phase of the project, the initial research phase, where we did a bunch of community consultation and community-based research.
Yeah, so one of the core risks and harms are the misidentification as a primary aggressor. And this can come about in a number of different ways, from a person that's using the violence, reporting against someone who's experiencing the violence, by police attending the scene and listing the person experiencing violence as a respondent on L17, or just really failing to understand the nuance of family violence situation. It might be that the person who's experiencing the violence might be acting and behaving in a form of protection or resistance. Or
that's misunderstood.
Or maybe there might be like drug use in play or mental health situations that exacerbate the person to look unhinged or unstable.
Yeah, and that can, again, be a really direct result of family violence. As we know, someone can be baited and, gaslit until they have a very understandable response, and then, what the perfect time for the police to present and then misidentify that person. And, of course, this makes, within our next point, makes the system ripe for weaponisation. As I said, the calling of police, the involving of systems, that can look like vexatious litigation. It can look like reports to child protection. it can become really sophisticated. So it can look like someone getting out an intervention order against someone that they wish to cause harm against, and then baiting them into breaching that order, say by offering access to kids, and then calling the police. And there you go. And of course, these creates a snowball effect. You know, the more it happens, the more someone's flagged within the system, the heavier and heavier and heavier that system comes in each time with that hammer of power and control. And of course, you know, this heavily impacts the ways in which people are able to access services. If someone's coming in with records, if someone's coming in as a respondent, if someone's flagged as a serious violent offender, and also that how they're going to feel then in the service environment, how confident they're going to be that they're going to be recognised, that their experience is going to be recognised, that they're actually going to receive succour and help and sanctuary and support. Yeah, all of these risks and harms overlap and intersect in really complex ways and in really unique ways for each individual. So it's important to see them as individual pieces, but also then weaving together to make a complex whole.
Yeah, and so when people who have been criminalised present to a family violence service or have police, there's no surprise to me that there's a criminalisation that can also occur as a result of that. And that can happen in a number of different ways. They might already be known to police. They might be self-medicating with alcohol and other drugs to reduce the impact of the trauma that they're experiencing, which we call self-medicating. They might be in moments of poverty or doing crimes of survival because they've been experiencing financial abuse.
Police take the rap.
Yeah. The police might also criminalise them because they're prioritising that over the person's safety. And there's also a variety of family violence related issues, like somebody maybe being silent or complicit, or again being protective or resisting.
Yeah, and that not being understood and leading to further criminalisation. And of course, this is heavily bound up, you know, Nina was talking about the discrimination that comes from presenting as having making alcohol or substance choices, or being in a period of mental distress. Also racial profiling. So systemic racism is horrifically stark in the disproportionate statistics around the criminalisation and incarceration of people of colour and Aboriginal people. Aboriginal women are hideously overrepresented in the prison population, as we saw in the statistics earlier. And of course, you know, right up to deaths in custody and at the hands of police. So yeah, it's very, very complex and overlapping and harmful.
And systemic trauma, of course, you know, criminalised folks have had extensive periods of time where they might have experienced systemic harm, abuse, violence and collusion. And so that might have been experienced by a person on an individual level, or families or friends might have these experiences, or also the experiences of community, and community become fearful of engaging with systems because of the trauma that they've experienced. It can be an act of resistance to not engage, and a way of protecting yourself from being further harmed.
Yeah, and that can be across multiple systems as well, you know, everything from the Department of Housing to child protection to juvenile detention and all of the above. So, you know, this can lead to incredible distrust. And, you know, our next point, stigma and discrimination, you know, sadly, criminalisation carries a heavy weight of stigma and discrimination. And this can lead to horrible feedback loops as well, where people are coming in feeling very unsafe and very distrusting. They might be hostile, they might be protective, they might be distressed. That attracts further stigma and discrimination, you know, which leads to further systemic trauma and so on and so on. And then the underlying supports that are needed are never actually received. Yeah.
And it's actually to no surprise that the next point comes up, because, you know, protective disengagement and self-exclusion, if you look at all the things and the points that we've already made and unpacked, you know, it's very apparent why somebody would disengage from a service or self-exclude themselves from a service, because of all of these complexities that criminalised victims are engaging with, that it can become really, really challenging, and they do that as a risk management strategy.
Absolutely. You know, and we can understand that through a family violence lens, right? People are doing really complex risk assessment and management on the daily to keep themselves safe. And as soon as the system is confusing, discriminatory, inconsistent, unclear, they're just going to go, okay, that's not safe, and they're going to withdraw and act to protect themselves. So we really, really need to deeply understand that there's so much bridge building to be done when trying to engage criminalised communities and individuals, to give them this, you know, to provide them with the support that they deeply deserve. Yeah.
Yeah, and especially as a society when we still have all these gendered stereotypes and like,
Yeah.
you know, being the mother or the criminal or the victim, and also playing into that thing of like being the perfect victim and what sort of stereotype that narrative has attached to it, and you know, how somebody might present and how somebody might be engaging, like, you know, they might be labeled then as the bad person, and you know what sort of implications that has, especially for somebody who's criminalised. It can lead them to further criminalisation and to be misidentified if they're presenting in a way that doesn't align with those narratives.
Yeah, those tropes of the ideal victim. Yeah, yeah. And, you know, that can also be internalized too and begin to be a narrative that somebody has about themselves. Like it must be so, you know, difficult to fight that constant feedback that you're bad, that you're wrong, that you're an unworthy victim. Yeah. So, you know, we have a ethical responsibility to try and mitigate that in our practice. Another issue, a core risk and harm, is the poor cohesion across sectors and systems. So, you know, we're already well aware of the ways in which different sectors get siloed and the impact that can have on people trying to access service. That can be really, really acute and harmful when it comes to people who are criminalised, because they have multiple systems that they are supposed to have obligations to, you know, that are impacting them, that have expectations of them, that are essentially existing in a power and control dynamic with them, whether that's child protection, whether that's police, whether that's the criminal legal system. This can play out in lots of really complex ways that result in core harms. One really concrete example is you can't currently access refuge from prison because you're technically considered housed. So, you know, if someone left a violent situation to go inside, when they're about to be released, they have a choice between going back to, you know, probably going back into that violent environment, or making themselves homeless before they can even begin to start the process of applying for refuge. And for all of these reasons, all of the intersections between these reasons, criminalisation significantly compounds all of the risks associated with family violence.
And also when you've been in prison for a period of time, whether you're sentenced or unsentenced, so remand or not remand, there's been a length of time where there's been no incident to report, a family violence incident. So also you might not be able to get assistance or services or apply for an intervention order.
You flagged as low risk, even though, you know, we know from our practice that actually the post-release period is a period of incredible risk and instability. Whatever supports existed before somebody went in, they've likely lost them or had them, you know, had them put at risk. They probably lost their housing. They may well have lost their kids. You know, it's a very, very high risk time, and yet the lack of wraparound services is really staggering.
And the person that was using violence against you is waiting for you on the outside.
Yeah.
So another quote, you're exploding your brain thinking about safety and risk every single day. You know your life, your circumstances. If a woman tells you that police will put her at risk, then you better believe that she knows that that is true. And I think that's really, really important to consider, because, you know, if those actions are taken and you actually call police, you're actually putting that person at a higher risk. One of the resources that we mentioned at the start is called Supporting Victim Survivors Who Do Not See Police as a Safe Option. And that's really important to unpack and use that resource, because we know that it's just not safe for everybody in community.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the resources draw really heavily on the lived expertise of people that we've consulted over the course of the project. And, you know, you saw a little case in point just now when we were going on about our core risks and harms, and then moved to this slide, and there it is, you know, perfectly succinct and summed up. Straight from the wisdom of experience. So yeah, we really urge you to lean on those as we have over the course of the project. I just want to take a minute to acknowledge too, like at this point, you're probably sitting with a feeling of, how am I going to navigate all of this complexity? How do I exist within this system that I'm also beholden to, whilst trying to ally myself alongside and walk alongside women who are experiencing family violence, you know, and it has no neat answer. It isn't tidy. It's very complex and it's deeply uncomfortable. And I think that there's a real kind of dissonance between the history of as it was then, the domestic violence sector, which was initially women in the street, in their homes, collectively organising grassroots by and for and alongside women. And fast forward, not a very long period of time, and now we are this complex, multi-layered system that is deeply bound up with other systems like police, like child protection. We have reporting obligations, and yet most of us have come into this work from that legacy of allyship. So now we're sitting in this space. What does it mean for our practice when these systems that we're so deeply bound up in and that we're conditioned to believe are fundamental to ensuring safety are not safe for everybody? So the next component of the training is centered around the practice points, both for us and for our organisational processes.
Yeah, and it might feel really, really big, but when we really unpack it, it's just really slow relational work. We know that victim survivors have experienced extensive harm, abuse, isolation, and so a lot of the time they haven't had opportunities to unpack things or to be heard or to be seen. So to listen, to believe, and validate are really, really important. Really, that deep listening. And when there is silence, be conscious not to feel that silence. Allow someone else to bring their narrative into that space and feel safe enough to share. And of course, to trust, you know, I think as criminalised women, there isn't a lot of trust established within when engaging with services, and you're constantly trying to advocate for yourself and present evidence that you need to be believed. So that believing and validating is really, really important, especially when it comes to acts of resistance.
And identification of systemic harms. You know, if somebody tells you that calling the police will make them less safe, believe them. If they say that a report was misconstrued or misunderstood or weaponized against them, believe them. Another way you can decarcerate your practice is decarcerating your language. And once you start to unpick at it, so much of our language centers around power and control. And I know as family violence practitioners, we're already used to thinking about this. So it's really just about expanding that lens to thinking about that in the context of the criminal legal system and our ideas and our languaging around risk and around safety and around power and around criminalisation. So, you know, instead of criminal, we say criminalised. Instead of charges, we might say acts of survival. Instead of assault, we might look at that act and go, that's an act of resistance. So just starting to think about the ways, our language is locating responsibility and is locating power. And the next point, supporting self-assessment, so important.
It's because carceral language can also be like a tool of blaming and shaming, can't it? So it's really important just to minimise that.
Absolutely.
So support self-assessment, like we've already mentioned, criminalised women are the experts of their own lives. And this is a foundational principle in the family violence sector. So this should also include criminalised women, not just other survivors, all members of community.
Yeah. And, you know, I think it's quite common that someone might assess that the system is actually a greater risk and harm to them in their experience and assessment than the perpetrator, the person who's causing them interpersonal harm. And it's not up for us to disabuse them of that understanding. We're not in that lived experience. And, you know, as that quote said earlier, it's like the system is the bigger perpetrator behind the perpetrator. So, what do we do? I think one of the most important things we can do is be honest. Be transparent, be accountable, be straight up and straightforward about systemic risks and harms and failures. Sometimes criminalised folks speak about feeling gaslit by the system because they feel like something is wrong or unjust, but the system is just proceeding like business as usual. And they're made to feel like they're actually the problem, particularly if they speak up and they become difficult, they become non-compliant and so on, and it compounds. So being really honest about what you can and can't provide. Part of this kind of decarceral practice is planning in advance for when the system fails and talking to the people that you're supporting about that and asking them how you can try and mitigate some of that harm and, you know, believing and validating the harm that they do experience and being willing to show up and say, I'm sorry, I know this sucks. It is really unfair. You know, just that in and of itself is decarceral practice.
Yeah, and I feel like the next point, documenting risks, harms, and acts of resistance, really go with the above too. It's all about, like, you know, really listening and supporting that self-assessment, and to be honest about those risks. And when you have communicated those, actually create a paper trail and document that stuff in order to provide evidence that supports the experience of the criminalised person, because that is an act of your resistance as a worker, and it really supports their narrative, and also provides that paper trail of, you know, those misleading third-party documents, and also lessens the work that we have to provide in consistently advocating for ourselves and providing evidence to support our narrative. If we have workers that are helping to do that for us, oh, what a godsend.
Absolutely. And, you know, you need to think that a lot of the systems that these people are operating within are actively looking for flaws and failures. So it's an incredible act of allyship to be the one who is documenting risks and harms and acts of resistance, because you might be the only one.
Yes.
You might be the only voice with any authority who's doing that. It's really important to have a critical lens on your own case notes and reporting. It has different impacts when it's someone who is criminalised and within multiple systems. You know, there's the therapeutic layer where you're like, okay, if the person was looking over my shoulder as I'm writing this, how would this feel? And then there's the systemic layer. So if you got a request for information sharing, how would your notes impact? Would they result in further criminalisation? Would they result in further systemic scrutiny or harm? These are things that we need to think about when we're working with folks who are criminalised.
And being really flexible and fluid about your approach, I think, is really, really important as well, you know, for victim survivors, and in particular those that have been criminalised. They've come up a lot of really rigid, controlling sort of behaviours and systemic responses. So, you know, in order to be really, really flexible, not to be rigid, because when as a criminalised person, when they sense that there's this rigid control, it can actually act in turn be an act of resistance and have them retract from the service.
Yeah, and that can feel re-traumatizing. Yeah, absolutely. That also extends to critically evaluating third-party information. So remember that systemic harm often looks like a lot of recording and a lot of reporting. And a lot of that is made by people who don't know the person, who aren't across their experience, who certainly haven't consulted them, who don't have the experience or a nuanced understanding of family violence, let alone the compounding interweave of family violence and criminalisation. And, you know, remember that even when something seems really straightforward and really simple, you know, she pled guilty to these charges, it is very rarely straightforward or simple. And yeah, this next quote is very powerfully illustrates this exact point.
Guilty doesn't mean guilty. It can mean a lot of things. It can mean you needed to get out of jail sooner, that you advised that your sentence would face to be doubled or more if you pled not guilty, because there is a lengthy delay waiting for a trial, or you just want it to be over. Getting out of jail might be the only way for some mothers to see their children at all, because you don't want to subject your kids to testify to what they've seen, because you urgently need treatment or support and you can't access this in prison. Or it just means that you were busted doing whatever you had to do in order to survive.
Yeah. And again, we return to that question, who are we keeping safe, and how are we keeping them safe, and what are we keeping them safe from, and why are we doing it? So how do we actually integrate this understanding into our organisational processes? So first up, we obviously have our intake. And I feel like this is a point, if criminalised people even make it this far, intake is often a point where they tap out and disengage. And that can be for so many reasons. If someone has a lot of systemic trauma, then getting slapped with a 14-page assessment is probably going to feel really, really terrifying. You know, if they're asked about police involvement or pushed to report to police, or even if their service is co-located with police, then that's an instant red flag for them. If they're worried about child protection or pushed even to talk about children and child protection matters without that safety or that rapport, or before someone has flagged allyship and flagged that they're on their side and that they believe them and they understand systemic trauma, then that's a red flag. They're just going to have their eyes on the door. So being really, really sensitive, you know, we have to do the processes that we have to do. We have to do our intake, but you know how much power there is in the way you approach it, and that framing of that understanding, that reaching out, that believing, that validating, that recognizing, you know, can hopefully build a bit of a bridge. That means it's possible for somebody to engage in that process without feeling like they need to run away.
And a decarceral safety planning. And we know, and we've spoken about now many times that, criminalised women, they have meticulously created risk management strategies and safety plans to support their sense of an agency over safety. And those needs to be really recognised and analysed and supported because it's really, really important to be culturally safe and responsive to criminalised folks.
Yeah. And so, core to this is identifying and responding to systemic risks and harms. And that means building that into our safety planning as part of this decarceral approach. I think the beauty of this is that we're building on what already exists within the family violence system. We already know how to safety plan. It's not doing something new. It's expanding the safety plan to incorporate systemic risk and harm, as well as the interpersonal risk and harm. So we're looking for and identifying and planning around things like vexatious litigation, like false reports to child protection, like if someone has identified police make them less safe, then how do we plan around what happens if police present? What happens if our organisation wants us to do a welfare check? How do we communicate and plan and mitigate around that to make that person safer and to ally ourselves with them in believing and validating the ways in which the system might put them at risk? Yeah.
And another one is just to recognise protective ambivalence and disengagement. There could be so many reasons why somebody is disengaging for a service, and it can be really, really dangerous to close those supports early. There's, they could be institutionalised. This includes hospitalised, in crisis, in moments of poverty. They might have just become homeless. There's all sorts of different crises that could be playing out for this person and why they're disengaging from the service.
Yeah. And I just think, having a therapeutic approach to people who are criminalised and experiencing family violence, who experience so much punitive power and control and rigidity, if we are then punitive in our in our capacity to work with them, and we're constantly threatening to close them because they're not compliant or they're protectively disengaging, think about the ways in which that might compound their other experiences. So it's not possible to be trauma informed in this case without being decarceral. Part of this too is engaging in protective and assertive referral processes. So given all of these complexities and given this need to build bridges, we can't just send someone to another service, without vetting whether or not that service is across this intersection of criminalisation and family violence. And we can offer that. We can offer that education and that support and that understanding as part of our support of the criminalised person. You don't want to send them to a service that then pushes them to contact police or makes a child protection report and alienates them. You've put them through that experience, but then you've also brought into jeopardy the own trust and rapport that you've been working so hard to build. So be really thoughtful about where and when and why and how you make referrals. So,
and that brings us to our last quote, which talks about the worker. So I had one worker who believed me. She was always in my corner. She gave me space to come to her, and she didn't treat me any different. She was honest with me so I could be honest with her. She would talk openly about the barriers in the system and how traumatizing it was.
And I guess my final thoughts before we wrap up are, look at this quote. I know this content is big and it's complex and it's messy and it's not comfortable, but you are needed to recognise and respond to these harms and to advocate for change and equity. I really hope that we've planted some seeds and encouraged you and provided you with a beginning space to educate yourself. Please do look at the resources that we've included with this training. And I really hope you feel inspired and challenged in a generative way. And we will pop up contact details for Flat Out up as well on a slide at the end. So do reach out if you would like more information or support or to inquire about further training.
And I'd also like to say thank you for giving us the time today, and something that I would like to talk about that I'm also learning to do is just to unpack and recognise that internal cop that comes up in my own mind, and recognising the power imbalances between me and the people that I'm trying to support, the unconscious biases that I have, And sometimes I have to catch myself too, just being aware of the judgments that live in my head and how they're playing out. And I know that, like, you know, it does sound really, really big and it does sound really, really complex, but at the end of the day, it's just like that quote states that, like, you know, it's just about being there, being present, being honest, being transparent, being supportive, and really, really listening. And just a final note, don't let the system get you down.
Thanks so much. Here's some details. And we're going to stop it there. Bye, everyone.
Bye.